All right. Today we're going to discuss the preamble and the introduction to Kant's work called the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Remember that this book was published a couple of years after his major work, The Critique of Pure Reason, was published in 1789. And it was published largely as a response to the widespread misinterpretation of what Kant was saying. Many regarded Kant's critique, or what he calls his critical philosophy, or sometimes transcendental idealism, as to be saying nothing more than what Berkeley had established, his subjective idealism. Kant is not arguing that there is no such thing as substance, because for Kant there certainly is a meaningful sense of substance to our experience, nor is Kant denying the existence of things in themselves. However, neither does he affirm the existence of things in themselves. Things in themselves, that is, the world as it might exist in and of itself, independently of the interpretation we apply to it, lies beyond what human understanding is capable of achieving. And this really goes back to what Locke had established, that what the mind must deal with, what it is confined to dealing with, are its own ideas. I cannot ever step outside of my own consciousness to have a direct encounter with things as they exist in themselves. So the question, of course, is if the thing in itself is an object existing apart from and inaccessible to human reason, then how is knowledge possible? And we saw that Hume devastates the possibility of achieving knowledge of a world from which we are distinct, separated. Again, Kant credits Hume with awakening him to this problem. And as Hume says, the question at hand is not whether the concepts which we employ to make sense of the world, like the concept of cause and effect, upon which all matters of fact are based, according to Hume, is a practical concept. The question is not whether or not the principle of cause and effect works, because clearly it does, as evidenced by our ability to predict the state of physical systems based on our principles of nature and observation of the current state of affairs of any physical system. Rather, the question is, do our concepts, what we call the laws of nature, consist of an inner truth? Are they true of the world itself and not simply practical devices that we employ to negotiate the world and to control it? Remember Hume's example that given two events, like ball A rolling into ball B, followed by the motion of ball B, we mistakenly make the judgment that these two events are connected necessarily, that there is an inner necessary relationship between these two events, such that whenever the one is given, the other must follow. Hume maintains that because we can neither establish the principle of cause and effect a posteriori, because we do not have a perception of the inner causality itself, nor can we establish the principle of cause and effect a priori, based on the relation of ideas, because no matter how long I analyze a piece of bread, for example, I could never reach the inference that this bread would nourish my body. I could tell you that the shape of the piece of bread as a square has certain properties which are eternal, like having 360 degrees, like having parallel opposite sides. But I could never infer simply by an analysis of what is contained in the concept of the piece of bread that it could nourish the body, any more than an analysis of a billiard ball could reveal to me that when set in motion on a trajectory toward another such ball, that upon impact it would cause motion in that latter. This relationship is nothing but a constant correlation. These two events are always found to occur one after the other. And because we are creatures of habit, we expect that the way things have always occurred in the past will continue to exist or occur in the future. And not only that, but we mistake this subjective habit of mind for an objective property belonging to the things in themselves. Now, if it is impossible for us to establish that there is a necessary causal relationship between these two events, or any two events, then we are relegated to probabilistic thinking. The most we can say is, this has always occurred in this particular fashion, and so I expect it will continue to do so in the future. So the question for Hume, as for Kant, is never one of the usefulness of the concept of cause and effect, or any of the other concepts that we employ to make sense of the world, but rather whether they consist of an inner necessity, whether they are true of the world itself. Okay? Now, when Kant speaks of judgments of experience, he means the ordinary, everyday kinds of judgments that are contained in our experience. For example, when I flip the light switch and the light comes on, even if I do not articulate the proposition that the switching of the light was the cause of the illumination of the bulb, I experience it that way. And according to Hume, I experience it that way simply as a matter of habit. Okay? Because our experience of such a causal or seemingly causal interaction invokes a principle like cause and effect, which we regard, mistakenly according to Hume, as a universal and necessary principle governing the behavior of things in themselves, even ordinary experience contains a metaphysical component. Because metaphysics is understood by Kant to mean the application of a universal principle to a determinate object of the understanding. And by a determinate object of the understanding, he simply means something we perceive. Okay? This desk is a determinate object of the understanding. Determinate meaning specific, a particular one. And by object of the understanding, he means an idea, a perception. So when I knock on the wall and I hear the sound, and I notice that every time I knock on the wall, a sound occurs simultaneously, this constant correlation of the two events, for Hume, leads me to make the judgment that there is a necessary inner relationship between those two events. But again, because I cannot prove that inner relationship, either as a matter of fact or simply as a relation of ideas, and since all matters of fact in some way boil down to the veracity or truth of the principle of cause and effect, then I cannot, strictly speaking, be said to know anything about the world. I can know certain relations of ideas because they are purely formal. Like if I say that A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then certainly just by relating these variables to one another, I can infer that A is equal to C. But that is simply an analytic judgment. I am simply analyzing what is contained in the idea of these concepts. If contained in the idea of A is the idea of B, namely that they are identical, and contained in the idea of B is the idea of C, meaning they are identical, then it follows A and C are also identical. But that does not expand my knowledge of the world. It doesn't teach me anything. All it does is to make clear what is already contained in the idea of saying that A is equal to B and B is equal to C. This is just a matter of valid deductive reasoning, but it does not expand my knowledge of the world. It simply explicates or explains what is already contained in these ideas. That's the nature of all deductive logical argumentation. In logic, we attempt to show what the relationship between propositions either must entail or cannot entail. When I have said that A is equal to B and B is equal to C, I have already said implicitly that A is equal to C. But what is implied by my premises, especially in very complex arguments, is not intuitively obvious. And so I must use the tools of logic, like natural deduction, or truth tables, or Venn diagrams, all of which you would learn about in a course like my logic course. But if I want to know about the world, if I want to know the real nature of the world as it exists as a thing in itself, then I need to show how it is possible. Okay? And again, since even the very simple judgment that the knocking is the cause of the sound employs the principle of cause and effect, which we regard to be a universal and necessary principle. But I can never establish the validity of a principle as universal and necessary based on inductive reasoning, meaning no matter how many times I experience one event followed by a second event, I can never make the claim that there is a real inner connection between them. That
there's no way to test it.
That's what I was thinking, like no math.
It is not that I can't test it in the sense of showing you under controlled conditions that every time the one occurs, the second occurs. Okay? But that's why scientists do not speak of causal relationships. They speak about correlations, tendencies. Okay? Because notice, for example, for a long time it was believed that all swans were white, because every time anybody had witnessed a swan, its feathers were white. And then somebody, probably Darwin, in the Galapagos Islands, discovered a swan with black feathers. Okay? And it only takes one counterexample to undermine even thousands of perceptions to the contrary. I cannot establish a universal necessary principle on the basis of particular and contingent perceptions. Okay? Because when I say that every event must have a cause, I am making a claim about every event that ever did or will occur. But we have never and never will experience every single event that ever has or will occur. Therefore, we are claiming to know something which goes beyond what our perception can teach us. But because we do say that every event has a cause, if that judgment is true of all possible experiences, then the question becomes, how is it possible? When I apply a universal necessary principle to a particular event, as I do when I say the knocking causes the sound, because I am employing the principle of cause and effect, I am making a metaphysical judgment, because I'm applying a universal principle to a determinate object of my understanding or my perception. Okay? So, to begin with, please understand that by metaphysics, as Kant means it in the title Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, he does not mean simply traditional metaphysics, wherein we are attempting to establish the existence of entities which we cannot experience, like God, or soul, or human freedom. I may see the effects of human freedom, but I cannot prove the existence of freedom because there is no perception of it, as the empiricists have said. I can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God because I have no perception thereof. Okay? Now we will get to Kant's argument regarding why those proofs are impossible later. And that's what is meant by a critique of pure reason, showing what reason is entitled to say and what its limitations are. Okay? And for Kant, human reasoning is structured in such a way as to be capable of judgments about only those objects which could be experienced. And one part of experience is perception. Okay? So let's back up now. So the question for both the critique of pure reason and the prolegomena to any future metaphysics, which is just a simplified version of the critique, in which he takes a slightly different approach. Okay? The question is, how is metaphysics possible? Okay? And, of course, the real pressing issue in the 17th and 18th century is that unless I can show how metaphysics is possible, I cannot claim to know anything about the world, because our everyday judgments of experience like A causes B, or the desk exists, or Descartes' wax is the same substance despite the changes to its accidental appearance. All of these judgments invoke universal concepts like existence, substance, cause. All right? So the main transcendental problem, as Kant calls it, and when Kant uses the word transcendental, he means making possible. Okay? So the main transcendental question asks, how is metaphysics possible? In the Prolegomena, he breaks this question down into 4 parts, which are, how is pure mathematics possible? Secondly, how is pure natural science possible? Third, how is metaphysics in general possible? And finally, how is metaphysics as a science possible? Okay? And I will explain the justification for breaking the main question about the possibility of metaphysics down into these 4 parts as we move along. Okay?
What was that last thing?
How is metaphysics as a science possible? First, he needs to show how metaphysics metaphysical judgments in general are possible. How can I make any judgment that contains a metaphysical element possible, like the judgment that when I'm hungry and I eat a sandwich, that the sandwich was the cause of assuaging the hunger. Okay?
So metaphysics to him is just the study of objects and our relationship to them, and how they provoke our senses.
Okay. Close. How objects give rise to sensations is part of his concern. Because unless we have a perception of some object or series of objects in space and time, then there is nothing to be explained. Okay? But also, by showing how metaphysical judgments in general are possible, he needs to demonstrate where the concepts we use, like the concept of cause and effect, come from. He will also need to show how it's possible for us to apply those concepts to our perceptions. Okay? So again, metaphysics for Kant basically means applying universal laws or principles to particular perceptions, which we do all the time. In fact, when Kant talks about judgments of experience, he is simply talking about our experience itself. Because when I knock on the wall and hear the sound, I don't give it a second thought. I immediately experience the knocking as the cause of the sound. It's that quick. I don't have to sit back and think about it. Okay? But Kant wants to know what entitles us to that judgment and what makes it possible. Remember, we can go back to the very simple example of a recording device. If I have a simple dictaphone, just a tape recorder, it is put together in such a way as to reproduce sounds, and that's it. What it is capable of representing or representing, okay, is completely determined by its structure, how it is put together, okay? And it is only capable of reproducing that which it is designed to reproduce. By analogy, Kant wants to know what is human reason designed to represent. How does it represent a world to itself as governed by universal laws and experienced in space and time? Okay? So the main question is, how is metaphysics possible? Okay. The first thing he does is to classify the kinds of judgments that we do in fact make. All right? And our judgments can be analyzed both in terms of their structure and their origin. So consider this. Some judgments, as Leibniz taught us, are analytic. Okay? You all remember what an analytic judgment is? An analytic judgment is one in which the predicate is already contained in the concept of the subject. So when I say the triangle has three sides, that's an analytic judgment, because all I need to do is analyze the concept of the triangle to conclude that it must have three sides. Okay? Other judgments are synthetic. Like what?
Like the triangle is red?
Yes, the triangle is red. Because no matter how long I think about the concept of a triangle, I could never know that a particular triangle happened to be red unless I perceived it with my eyes. Okay?
Non-essential.
Right. Red is a non-essential property of that particular triangle. And so, a synthetic judgment is such that the predicate, in this case redness, is not contained in the concept of the subject triangle, but rather it is added to it. And that's what it means to synthesize, to bring together, whereas to analyze is to pull apart. Okay? So whether a judgment is analytic or synthetic is a matter of the structure of the judgment. Whether the predicate is already contained in the subject or if it is superadded to the subject. But there is also the question of where these judgments originate. Some judgments are a priori. And what does that mean?
Just understood.
Yeah, not based on the senses, right? The rationalists began with the premise that knowledge is possible a priori, or that knowledge is possible by an exercise of reason alone, unassisted by sensory perception. You might say that, yes, Plato argued that we must already have some vague, innate conception of the forms. Okay? Right. And learning is refining or recollecting, remembering those essential essences of things. Okay? Descartes said, I have two innate ideas, strictly a priori, the idea of myself and the idea of God, whereas the empiricists deny any strict a priori knowledge. Okay? When Hume says that, well, I can make an a priori judgment, for example, that the bachelor is unmarried, actually that's probably better expressed as an analytic judgment rather than an a priori judgment, because I never would have known what a bachelor was until I learned about it on the basis of the senses. Heard about it, read about it, okay? But there are also judgments a posteriori, which means from the senses, based on the senses. And most of the judgments we make about the world depend upon something a posteriori. Okay? Even if I make the judgment that the switch causes the light to come on, I could never make that judgment unless I had a sensory perception of flipping the switch and the light coming on. Now, we're going to talk about how those perceptions are possible. But the deeper question is, where does the concept of cause and effect come from that we apply to that perception to make the judgment of experience that the switch is the cause of the light? Okay. So let's give an example of each kind of judgment. According to Kant, all analytic judgments are a priori. Okay? Like what you've already said. The triangle has 3 sides. It is analytic because the 3 sides, the predicate, already belongs to the concept of the subject triangle. In fact, I cannot think about a triangle without also thinking about the 3 sides. Okay? And it is an a priori judgment, not in the sense that I was born with an idea of triangularity,
but rather, if you tell me that you have just drawn a triangle, and I believe you, then I know without using my senses, coming over and looking at it, that it has three sides. Okay? So you understand this looser sense of the a priori.
You didn't have to see it to know it, I guess. You didn't have
Right.
to sense it to know it.
Exactly. Now, at some point, if the empiricists are correct, and until I have a sensory perception, the mind is a blank piece of paper, I didn't know what triangles were. But once I do have exposure to what a triangle is, okay, then I no longer need to go count the sides. Okay? If I know that you have a triangle, I also know that you've got three sides without having to use my senses to confirm it. Okay? And you've also already given me an example,
Synthetic a posteriori.
yes, of a synthetic a posteriori judgment. Very good. The triangle is red. Okay? It is a posteriori, because how else would I know that the triangle was red unless I saw it? Or you told me about it, which is using my hearing. Okay? And it is a synthetic judgment because no amount of analysis of the idea of a triangle could tell me that some particular triangle was red. Okay? It is a synthetic judgment because I am combining the concept of triangle with the predicate of redness. All right? Now, there are no analytic a posteriori judgments because it would be absolutely silly for me to say that I know my next door neighbor is a bachelor, but I'm going to go ask him whether or not he is a man. Okay? It's redundant, right? It is completely unnecessary for me to go confirm what I already know. If I know that you have drawn a triangle, all right, then I also know you have drawn three sides. I don't have to come look at it. Okay? So these are silly. I mean, yeah, it's possible, I suppose, maybe this is the way we learn. If I tell you, okay, I'm going to teach you what a triangle is, and I have you look at it, okay, then you learn the meaning of the word triangle by observing a three-sided closed figure, okay? But you only have to do that once.
Well, a posteriori is from the senses,
Right.
And analytics is supposed to be meant to pull apart essential elements of things.
Yes.
So you can't really have those two together because everything you're perceiving is not any.
Well, it's just that it's redundant and unnecessary. Okay? I mean, look, I would agree with the empiricists that unless I had a sensory experience of some shape and was taught that we call this a triangle, okay, I never would have known that there was such a thing, okay? But once I do know what a triangle is, I don't need to count its sides ever again, okay?
So like synthetic a priori, would that be like a square has more sides than a triangle? That's something you're seeing from a sense perception.
Let's think about this, because these are the interesting ones.
Yeah.
Okay?
Is that like A equals C, like the relation?
No, that I can do just on the basis of analysis. Okay? But A causes B. Like Hume's billiard balls, or the switch in the light, or the bread satisfying hunger. Those are both synthetic and a priori.
Because you put two different things together.
I'm bringing two things together. That's the synthetic part, right? Like ball A striking ball B, and ball B being set in motion. Okay?
Ring will cause an effect in this sense. Kant.
But that is just a perception. I perceive the one ball move up to the second ball, and then I perceive the second ball begin to move. All right? But I synthesize, again, that perception with the concept of cause and effect.
So how does that make it a priori?
Because
There's no
if I say every event has a cause, that principle could never be derived a posteriori.
There's nothing from the senses that tells you.
That tells me that every event has a cause. Or even that this particular event was caused by some other event. So if I say that A is the cause of B, or if I say like Descartes, that the wax before it is melted is the same substance as after it is melted, I have synthesized my perception of the two appearances of the wax with the concept of substance to unite them. Okay? So in a synthetic a priori judgment, I am synthesizing something perceived and something conceived. What Kant calls percepts and concepts.
So
Okay.
you predicted and then you saw it happen, basically.
What makes it possible for me to predict, I mean, look, I could predict,
The concept of cause and effect, but it's basically validated by sensory perception, is it? Or
yeah, every time I see that after ball A rolls into ball B rolls, my understanding of the concept of cause and effect is validated. Okay? But if under very controlled conditions, I were to discover that the principle of cause and effect were violated, then I'd have to give it up. But according to Kant, that can never happen. And we'll see why. Okay? So, perceptions are a posteriori. Okay? Concepts, and this is the key, must be a priori. Because whether I say, just in the case of this particular causal relationship, that A causes B, or if I make the general claim that every event must have a cause, I am claiming knowledge of a universal and necessary principle that governs the behavior of objects in space and time. And a universal necessary judgment can never be based on a perception. because perceptions are always particular and contingent. I perceive this ball rolling into that ball. I do not perceive a universal. You can't perceive a universal.
But you conceive it.
Yes, I can conceive of a universal principle. And that is what Kant means by being rational. The ability to formulate universal principles is what it means to be rational. Universality is the form of rational thought. And metaphysics is just the application of those universal principles to particular perceptions. Okay? So our question is, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? If I can answer how synthetic a priori judgments are possible, I will have answered how metaphysics is possible. So the question, how is metaphysics possible, must be addressed by demonstrating how judgments synthetic a priori are possible. And that is precisely what he's doing in the Critique of Pure Reason, showing how synthetic a priori judgments are possible. The perception comes through my senses, but where does the concept, universal and necessary, of causality come from? Now, what Kant realized, not only that Hume was correct, that a universal necessary principle like cause and effect can never come from perception, because perceptions are always particular and contingent, but that cause and effect is not the only principle that we employ when making judgments of experience. Substance is another one. Again, when Descartes says, I know that the wax before and after it is melted is the same substance, he has employed a universal principle, substance, and applied it to a particular perception, in this case, the changing appearance of the wax. But if you ask Descartes, what entitles you to make the judgment that it is the same substance, that it's a material substance, he says, well, I can't see the material substance, so it must be known by an act of intellect. Okay? Now, actually, he is aligned with Kant there. But what he doesn't show us is how it's possible that we are capable of making judgments that contain a universal necessary concept. Okay? And the problem for Descartes is that he is still working with the subject-object paradigm. He is saying that the mind knows the existence of material substance, which exists in reality. The material substance is a thing in itself, which is independent and real whether or not I have a perception of, I have an experience of it. So what Kant is going to do to show how we can avoid the skeptical conclusion that knowledge is not possible is to show us that there is no subject-object dualism. That the world, as I experience it, that is, as a systematic unity of objects in space and time governed by universal necessary laws, is not the perception of something which exists apart from us, but rather the principles that we employ when we make judgments about experience are all built a priori into the structure of human reason. Space and time are not containers within which objects exist. Rather, they are the forms of our intuition. And by intuition, he means seeing. Okay? The way that our reason or our mind is structured, and I'm not saying here designed, okay? I'm just saying this is the way we are put together. This is the way things are. Human reason is designed to perceive spatially and temporally. It's the only way we can perceive things. Space and time are forms of our intuition, so that whatever is given to our senses, whether it's a sound or a sight or a tactile sensation, a fragrance or a taste, they are possible only because part of my reason, which Kant calls the sensibility, orders those perceptions in space and time. Whatever the thing in itself is, whatever is out there that prompts me to have my experiences, okay, which Kant says probably does exist. After all, like Descartes said, things come to me against my will, okay, gets poured into the mold of my sensibility. Space and time for Kant are like filters or built-in glasses, lenses, so that whatever I perceive is immediately ordered in space and in time. Space and time are not properties belonging to things in themselves. They are the forms of my intuition that make perception possible in the first place. Objects are objects only because they are gathered up by my sensory apparatus, the structure of which is space and time. It's like we are all born with space-time glasses. Right? If I put on a pair of rose-colored glasses, then the whole world looks rosy. Well, we have space-time lenses, and we can't take them off. So whatever we perceive, whatever I look at, or hear, or touch, taste, smell, will necessarily be an object in space and time, because space and time are the forms of my sensibility. They're the forms of intuition. And he's going to say the same thing about the principles which we then apply to those perceptions. The concepts are also a priori, but they are located in what Kant calls the understanding. I perceive two objects in space and time, one of them being prior to another one, but proximate enough to one another in space and time that I understand them to be related by the concept of cause and effect. But like space and time, cause and effect is not a property of the thing in itself. It is an a priori concept of my understanding that makes the experience possible. And so the laws of nature are not derived from my perception of the world. I don't read the laws of nature off of my perceptions. Rather, the laws of nature just are the structures of my rationality that make experience possible in the first place. The way I experience the world is the only way I can experience the world, according to the forms of my intuition, space and time, and the concepts of my understanding, of which there are 12. We've only talked about 2 of them, cause and substance. Okay. So the world of my experience is governed by, it is structured, completely put together by my rationality. So you can see why people started to think that Kant was just saying what Berkeley was saying. But Kant is not saying that the world is just an idea. Kant is saying that my experience of the world is made possible by the structure of my reason. So I can only experience the world in space and time and according to the laws of physics. Because the laws of physics are nothing but the concepts of my understanding. All right, do your reading. We'll pick it up next time.